Hello everyone, welcome to the next review. This is Leaf by Niggle by Tolkien. I had thought about doing a review for this for some time. Indeed, I mentioned it in my book list video in connection with Tree and Leaf, a collection of short works by Tolkien. So Tree and Leaf consists of, for one, Mythopoeia, which is a poem I've read on the channel before. If you've listened to it, you'll be aware that it's a grand poem about myth making and mythology and ideas of supernaturalism versus scientific materialism, things like this. Another element of Tree and Leaf is the seminal essay on fairy stories, which again concerns subcreation and again the uses of fantasy, and it's one of my favourite essays of all time. Highly recommend. I may actually be doing a review for that essay at some point. One of the ones that I didn't read in Tree and Leaf is The Homecoming of Beornoth, which I believe is a translation or a reinterpretation of a Saxon poem by Tolkien. I didn't actually read that at the time because I wasn't quite interested in kind of Saxon history at the time and whatnot. I just didn't really feel like I get much from it. So the last work in Tree and Leaf is Leaf by Niggle, a short story. On my PDF version, I read it just reread it a couple of hours ago. In fact, it was about 10 pages, so it was fairly short. I had wanted to review this for some time. However, it concerns ideas of creation and time and putting things off and whatnot. So it's kind of a poignant story for me, and I was actually quite emotional at the end of this story. Not quite as affected, of course, as when I first read it, but so Leaf by Niggle concerns a man called Niggle, which again, in a quite a Peakian sense, that the name is brilliant. It gives you an idea of kind of these niggling doubts that he has, and the kind of fretting, kind of anxiety that he may have. Although he's a very kind man, he doesn't really say much. In that respect, he almost reminds me of Piranesi in Piranesi, Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, if you've read that story. So this quiet man, he just wants to get on with painting. He has a lot of sketches in his shed, and he's done a lot of paintings and studies and whatnot. But his main work, which I guess we could call the Great Tree, is a painting of a magnificent tree. I believe it started as a kind of a sketch of a leaf, and Niggle is fascinated by just trying to make each leaf as distinct as possible. But he finds over time that the tree has become something more. It's kind of this living tree, kind of a very expansive work of art. Indeed, the painting, in fact, takes up the entire shed. He needs a ladder to climb up to continue painting on it. There's a kind of a sprawling forest in the distance as well, and there's kind of a scarcely guessed at kind of mystical border where there is a kind of a mountainscape. Niggle just can't seem to finish his work. He's always having to go and do chores for people, and and his neighbour, his only neighbour in fact, since he lives in a kind of secluded area outside of town, a man called Parish. He's constantly asking Niggle to do chores for him because he has a lame leg. So that might be things like going into town to fetch the doctor so that Parish's wife can get treatment. That may be things like patching Parish's roof because the tiles have come off and the rain's dripping down into Parish's house. And indeed, we get quite a good sense of Parish's character because he comes to ask Niggle for help about the tile situation, and he points to the canvas and says, "Why? What about that? Why can't I use that to patch the roof up?" And as you can imagine, Niggle is horrified. So Parish is a kind of a pragmatic character. He doesn't really see the use of art. So there's a great contrast between Niggle and Parish. But there's an interesting thing here, and it reminds me very much. I kind of view it as Tolkien's version of Hesse's Narcissus and Goldmund, about synthesis, about contrast being kind of melded together and coming together, and you can't have one without the other, and kind of complementary things. And what I mean by that is Niggle is aware that he should not be neglecting his duties. He should be within the world, taking part in the community. But he also has this other pull to focus on his art, to be productive in that sense as well, to be an artist, to complete his great tree. And he very much begrudges, although he's very kind, inwardly he begrudges the townspeople for constantly asking him for help. So where the story really broadens out is, of course, it's a Tolkien work, so it has this kind of greater meaning to it. Um, we're aware that there's a kind of great journey that Niggle has to go on. We're not, in fact, aware of what this journey is, and Niggle doesn't really have a good idea of what it means as well. But one day a man comes to collect him, and he has to leave his great work behind unfinished. And I would just say, as you'll be aware that this review is a spoiler review, um, most people view this journey as death. So he goes on this train journey and he ends up in I believe it's called a hospital infirmary, where he's kind of tasked doing menial chores, digging and whatnot, kind of very harsh and brutal, and harsh brutal surroundings. The people are quite severe. They don't talk to him that much, and he's kind of confused about what's going on. It's almost like a prison, in fact. And as time goes on, he actually forgets about his great tree, and he becomes aware of the uses of kind of just performing mundane tasks, kind of utilitarian tasks. So he continues working like this for some time. And one day he goes to sleep, and he's just lying in the dark, and he hears two voices speaking, kind of a harsh first voice, and a kind of more gentle but very commanding second voice. And they're kind of deliberating, almost kind of a jury, almost like a jury, kind of a court situation, where they're kind of looking back at Niggle's life. They call it the Niggle case. They're kind of going through how he lived. So they come to the conclusion that despite Niggle begrudging the people asking him to do tasks and whatnot, they are also aware that he made sacrifices. For example, getting on his bike in the rain to go and fetch help for for Parish's wife. So they come to the conclusion that Niggle deserves a kind of reward. He deserves relief. He has performed well enough in life, or he's the right intentions. So we will send him somewhere. So he goes on this journey on a train, a kind of newly painted, kind of newly refurbished train, kind of a pleasant short journey to I guess what could be described as a kind of downland. I imagine as a kind of downland, kind of green, pleasant landscape. And he comes to this gate, kind of set in a hedge, and by that gate is his bike. And he takes a kind of a pleasant bike ride through the hills, and then he the falls off the bike, and he looks upon his great tree. I just felt that was it's a great moment, because just the fact that he's so awed by his work, that this representation of his work, that he kind of just falls off it. He's completely stunned by it. And in fact, I said representation. In fact, this is not a representation of the great tree. It is the living tree. It's the great tree. It's not the sub-creation. It is the creation. It's the thing made real. And it's just, obviously, as you can imagine, it's almost difficult to imagine. It's this great colossal tree branching out in every which way, and I believe the blossoms are compared to flame. It's just as beautiful. It's almost like Toperion and Laurelin from Silmarillion, kind of that majesty of that level of beautiful tree. And so he just wanders around, just contemplating his tree and whatnot, and he obviously sees in the horizon this forest and the mountains as well, and there's an interesting, quite a poignant description where it says there's always a feeling of distance, even if he gets closer to the forest and the mountains in the background. There's always a sense of distance. So I think it's always this feeling of being. I think for me, what I got from that is it's this sense of there's always something to look forward to. There's always something that can be done, but not in a negative sense. There's always a kind of a yearning that makes you move on. That's kind of what I got from it anyway. I'm not quite sure that is a correct interpretation, or however you want to say it. So this could really be construed as the afterlife, and in fact, indeed, the second voice could be construed as God, who was the one that sent Niggle to this beautiful landscape, this kind of otherworldly realm where all of his creations have come to fruition. Now, where the story really becomes interesting is, again, spoilers of course, Parish ends up in this realm. I would take that to mean that Parish has died. And so what I find very poignant and interesting about this part of the story is that Parish becomes aware of Niggle's sensibility, his goals, his kind of yearning, his striving. Um, he sits and just looks at the tree and contemplates it, and he thinks, this is phenomenal. This is something to appreciate." Again, thinking back to his original viewpoint, where he didn't have any concern for art or beauty or anything close to that. Um, and interestingly, again, coming back to this idea of opposites coming together, kind of a synthesis being made. Niggle, on the other hand, becomes more attentive to the work of the earth, of gardening, of creating things, of making things with his hands, helping others, not just making his work, hyper focusing on his work. So there's kind of they both change in this way in this realm, and they both make the realm even better because of that. They make a house, for example. They explore. They create a garden of their own. They kind of just flourish, having become who they are. They kind of come into their true selves by this kind of melding together of two of these different traits, these different worldviews. But over time, Niggle is drawn to the mountains in the background, and he, very much in a Bilbo-esque sense, he's drawn to the mountains and he wants to explore more. And so he leaves his friend Parish behind. And indeed, I think we are to take this realm as having been accessible upon death, because Parish says that he will wait for his wife to come. So that's really where the story ends. Niggle goes off with a shepherd into the woods, into the hills, and presumably into the mountains. And there are various ways that we can envisage what these mountains mean. Indeed, I read online there's a couple of versions, but I probably won't go into those so much. But there's a true ending to the story. After a scene break, it concerns a conversation between three people. They're kind of talking about Niggle and what he stood for and his life and how he progressed and whatnot. There's a man called Councillor Tompkins who just utterly despises the idea of Niggle. In fact, he's almost like Parish taken to the extreme. And we learn that this man is he's taken possession of Niggle's house, and he owns the place, and everything that Niggle owns is gone. And in fact, we learn that not only was the great tree, the original canvas depicting the great tree, was used to patch up the house, Parish's house next door. Pieces of it were found in a field far away. However, all is not lost. There's a man called Aikens who is very much more perceptive to Niggle's life and what he stood for, and in quite a poignant last couple of sentences, we learn that Aiken took a section of Niggle's The Great Tree, just a corner of it as found in the field, and he preserved it. In fact, he framed it. And this is just a small bit of canvas depicting one single leaf of the great tree. And we eventually learn that this framed bit of work, called Leaf by Niggle, ends up in a museum. The museum burns down, and so there's no trace left of Niggle's work. "I am worried, very worried. I wish I was not lame," said Parish. So Niggle went. You see, it was awkward. Parish was his neighbour, and everyone else a long way off. Niggle had a bicycle and Parish had not, and could not ride one. Parish had a lame leg, a genuine lame leg, which gave him a good deal of pain. That had to be remembered, as well as his sour expression and whining voice. Of course, Niggle had a picture, and barely time to finish it. But it seemed that this was a thing that Parish had to reckon with, and not Niggle. Parish, however, did not reckon with pictures, and Niggle could not alter that. "Curse it," he said to himself as he got out his bicycle. It was wet and windy, and daylight was waning. No more work for me today, thought Niggle. And all the time that he was riding, he was either swearing to himself or imagining the strokes of his brush on the mountain, and on the spray of leaves beside it that he'd first imagined in the spring. His fingers twitched on the handlebars. Now he was out of the shed. He saw exactly the way in which to treat that shining spray which framed the distant vision of the mountain. But he had a sinking feeling in his heart, a sort of fear that he would now never get a chance to try it out. Then he should not have neglected so many, said the first voice. All the same, he did answer a good many calls. A small percentage, mostly of the easier sort, and he called those interruptions. The records are full of the word, together with a lot of complaints and silly imprecations. True, but they looked like interruptions to him, of course, poor little man. And there's this. He never expected any return, as so many of his sort call it. There is the parish case, the one that came in later. He was Niggle's neighbour, never did a stroke for him, and seldom showed any gratitude at all. But there is no note in the records that Niggle expected Parish's gratitude. He does not seem to have thought about it. Yes, that is a point, said the first voice, but rather small. I think you will find Niggle often merely forgot. Things he had to do for Parish he put out of his mind as a nuisance he had done with. Still, there is this last report, said the second voice, that wet bicycle ride. I rather lay stress on that. It seems plain that this was a genuine sacrifice. Niggle guessed that he was throwing away his last chance with his picture, and he guessed too that Parish was worrying unnecessarily. I think you put it too strongly, said the first voice, but you have the last word. It is your task, of course, to put the best interpretation of the facts. Sometimes they will bear it. What do you propose? I think it is a case for a little gentle treatment now, said the second voice. Niggle thought that he had never heard anything so generous as that voice. It made gentle treatment sound like a load of rich gifts, and the summons to a king's feast. Before long he found that the path on which he had started had disappeared, and the bicycle was rolling along over a marvellous turf. It was green and close, and yet he could see every blade distinctly. He seemed to remember having seen or dreamed of that sweep of grass somewhere or other. The curves of the land were familiar somehow. Yes, the ground was becoming level, as it should, and now, of course, it was beginning to rise again. A great green shadow came between him and the sun. Niggle looked up, and fell off his bicycle. Before him stood the tree, his tree, finished. If you could say that of a tree that was alive, its leaves opening, its branches growing and bending in the wind, that Niggle had so often felt or guessed, and had so often failed to catch. He gazed at the tree, and slowly he lifted his arms and opened them wide. It's a gift, he said. He was referring to his art and also to the result, but he was using the word quite literally. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the review. Till next time.